Hi, everyone. We're just waiting a few more minutes for people to join, and then we get started. Okay, I think it's time to start. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session on supply chain management. And let's see if I can figure out the slide. Perfect. My name is Christian, and with me today is my colleague Konstantin, and we will share with you some information on relevant EU regulations, our experiences from working with clients, and how we help them manage risks and opportunities in their supply chain. And Konstantin has been following the developments of the EU regulations very closely and will be focusing on this today. And I will cover the more practical aspects of our work and experiences. And just to let you know, a recorded version of this webinar will be available in a few days on our website. We would also love to hear from you during this webinar, so feel free to use the chat function. We will have a brief Q&A towards the end of our presentation, and we'll answer some of your questions then. In case we do not have time to answer your question, we will try to send you a response next week. So I am very excited to talk about this topic with you today. So with no further ado, let's begin. So these are the main topics that we will cover in today's session. First, Konstantin will give a brief introduction to three different EU frameworks and how they relate to supply chain management. Then I will talk a little bit about some risks and opportunities that we think businesses should consider before I present some tips and recommendations on how to mitigate these risks. In the last part, we will give you a quick introduction to some of our system solutions related to supply chain management. And we will end the session with a brief Q&A. So now it's time for me to pass you over to my colleague, Konstantin, who will take you through the first agenda point of today.
All right. Thank you, Christian, and also a warm welcome from my side today. So today I want to talk you briefly through three different European sustainability regulations. As some of you might experience that recently there is a surge in sustainability regulations that are targeting different kinds of companies in different kind of areas. And at a very first glance, it can be quite overwhelming seeing all those requirements that are set out to companies to report on. But when diving a little bit deeper into those details, you might see that there have been recently some great efforts to harmonize the existing and the new regulations with each other in order to mitigate the burden that companies are facing right now when it comes to the reporting. So today I want to focus on three different regulations that are focusing on supply chain management, or at least have some parts that relate to supply chain management in it. There will be a new regulation, a future regulation, as well as one regulation that is already in the game for some years. First off, I will talk about the CSDDD, the so-called Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. This is a directive that mandates member states to have their own national human rights due diligence acts in practice and set out requirements for those. This is a future regulation. Then we have the new regulation, the CSRD. This is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. You have to bear with me today. There are a lot of acronyms when it comes to EU regulations, but I'm sure we'll manage together. And this regulation deals with what companies have to report on when it comes to sustainability matters. And lastly, the old rabbit in the game, still quite new though, but the oldest of those three is the EU taxonomy regulation. That is pretty much a classification system for companies in order to identify how their business practices are green according to the European Union's idea of sustainability. Alrighty, let's start with the first one, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. So first of all, who is going to be targeted by this? There are two groups of companies. The first one are companies with more than 500 employees that have a net turnover of more than 150 million euros. And in group two, we have companies that are in a so-called high impact sector, which are textiles, agriculture, or the extraction of minerals, with more than 250 employees and a net turnover of 14 million euros. Furthermore, this directive also applies for non-EU companies as soon as they're fulfilling those thresholds set out in Group 1 and 2, when their thresholds for the turnover are generated within the EU. But when it comes to when all this actually enters into force, there's not too much clarity on that yet. But the CSDDD is expected to enter into negotiations between the European Parliament, the Council, and the EU Commission later in 2023, with the aim of adoption in 2024. Once the CSDDD will be adopted, member states then have 2 years' time to transpose this directive into national law. But what is it actually? What do we deal with this directive here? With the CSDDD, companies shall conduct human rights and environmental due diligence by regarding actual and potential adverse impacts throughout their value chain, including their own operations. And previously, sustainability due diligence, or due diligence rather, has been associated just with the social side of things when looking at workers' rights, human rights, and so forth and so forth. But now the EU is widening the scope with this directive, also including the environment and governance factors in it. And by that, it also generates a level playing field, because right now you have several national human rights due diligence acts in place, like, for example, the Norwegian Åpenhetsloven, the German Lieferketten-Sorgfaltspflichtengesetz. There's also a French one and a Dutch one. However, those vary quite vast in the extent of what kind of companies they're including and what kind of areas of sustainability topics they're including into that. So by creating this general corporate sustainability due diligence directive, this will also be harmonized, and comparability and transparency will be guaranteed, and this generates the so-called level playing field. The next regulation here that has to do with supply chain management is the so-called CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Over here, this directive takes a big step away from voluntary reporting when it comes to sustainability data towards mandatory sustainability data. And it includes also a larger amount of companies than previously directives did. So first off, we have the large EU public interest entities. These public interest entities you can understand as like listed companies, banks, insurers, or those companies offering financial products, and those companies that have more than 500 employees within this category. Those will be the first companies targeted by this because these are the companies that are already falling under the non-financial reporting directive, the NFRD. But the CSRD aims a little bit bigger than that. So they also aim to include other companies, other EU companies, and want to get their sustainability data and want to have them reporting on those. And these are companies that fulfill two of those following thresholds. It's like more than 250 employees, a turnover of more than 40 million euros, or having more than 20 million euros on the balance sheet. These are companies that will start their reporting in 2026 already for the financial year 2025. At later stages, even listed SMEs, as well as non-European companies with a turnover of more than 150 million euros will be targeted by the CSRD. Yeah, so at a first glance, the CSRD doesn't directly have to do anything with sustainability supply chain management, you might think, as this directive reports on what companies have to report in regard to their sustainability topics. However, in order to identify what topics a company has to report on, you shall conduct a so-called double materiality assessment. An assessment where you look at your company's potential or actual negative impacts, and where you look at what kind of financial, how can you as a company be financially impacted by risks and opportunities that arise out of sustainability topics. And just when it comes to that area, a functioning and effective supply chain due diligence process is very, very important for you in order to identify those areas where you as a company create adverse impacts. And there, the CSRD focuses on all those three pillars of sustainability, environment, social, and governance in your own operations and throughout your value chain. Lastly, I want to talk about the EU taxonomy regulation, this classification system that we're having in the EU. First of all, there are large public interest entities, just again, those banks, insurers, listed companies, for example, with more than 500 employees that are already targeted by it and that have to report on it. And in Norway, actually, next year, the first year of reporting starts for the financial year of 2023. Later on, even smaller companies will be targeted by the EU taxonomy, as this will follow the timelines set out by the CSRD. But how is this regulation tied to an effective supply chain management? Because first and foremost, the EU taxonomy should classify your company's economic activities in how green they are. And in doing so, you're looking at whether your economic activity contributes substantially to one of those 6 environmental objectives that the EU has set out. And you shall guarantee that you do no significant harm in any of those by conducting this economic activity. While there's a huge focus on the environmental side of things, the EU acknowledges that sustainability has to be built on 3 cornerstones, where the social side of things and the governance side of things also are embedded in. That's why they have the so-called minimum safeguards. And that's where it gets interesting from a supply chain point of view. Because over here, the minimum safeguards, among other things, want companies to conduct a due diligence process that follows those 6 steps outlined in the UN guiding principles on businesses and human rights. I will not name all those 6 steps, but generally, you can say that companies have to identify their adverse impacts. They have to come to solutions to seize, prevent, or mitigate those. And then finally, they also have to communicate what they are doing, what negative impacts they are having, and so forth and so forth. And over there, you're looking at the whole value chain again. So now that we have briefly talked about those different regulations, I think it's kind of like time to summarize those key similarities that we are experiencing. So as you can see in the very first table, there's quite a huge overlap when it comes to the sustainability topics that are covered by those 3 different frameworks, as well as you see that all of them include the whole supply chain. The only difference there is that the minimum safeguards, so the supply chain management part of the EU taxonomy, does not cover the environment, because the environment is already covered in its own activities in a way. And I think that's a good takeaway for you as well, to see that even though those regulations that are targeted at different areas of companies' operations still have this vast overlap here, which makes it easier for companies to adjust to it and minimizes the burden companies have to bear. I think now that we know what the similarities are, I think it's also good for you to understand how those different regulations are linked together in a greater relationship over here. So let us start with the CSDDD. This one is the one that requires companies to conduct an effective sustainability due diligence process. And this is one cornerstone for the CSRD, as this one informs the double materiality assessment, which looks at what kind of topics you have to later report on. Furthermore, those adverse impacts, those are potential or actual that you have identified, you should report on. You should say where those lie, how they are connected to your business, what policies, actions, and targets are you setting yourself to mitigate these or prevent them, and then communicate your process and your effectiveness there as well. Finally, the EU taxonomy. This connection might be a little bit more difficult to understand, but let me give you an example of how this could be connected to that as well. Let's say you identified in your double materiality assessment that the topic of climate change, for example, is a very relevant topic for you as a company. So therefore, you should report your sustainability data on that. One part of that is also to disclose your EU taxonomy KPIs. And these KPIs are basically indicating on how well your business is aligned with those environmental objectives set out by the EU, as well as following this sustainability due diligence process. So that's pretty much how everything is connected to each other. And I hope you get a better understanding of those regulations in this brief time. But I think I'll give the word over now to Christian, who will go through some more practical details on how you as a company can work on your supply chain management.
Thank you very much, Konstantin. That was very insightful. And I hope it was insightful for you who are watching as well. So these regulations that Konstantin explained demonstrate the importance of being aware of and managing your supply chain. Not only do businesses have an ethical responsibility for mitigating and reducing adverse impacts, many are now currently also required to do so by a number of different regulations, as we can see. So, as Konstantin mentioned, the rest of the webinar will focus a bit more on the practical aspects of supply chain management, starting with highlighting some of the risks and opportunities that we believe are important to consider regarding ESG. So, each and every organization will have a different risk profile, and it's important that you investigate which risks are material to you. However, there are some categories that all businesses should consider. In front of you, you'll see different topics of occurrences and implications. And an occurrence in your supply chain is something that will affect your business in a negative or positive way. And in this case, we are focusing on the negative. For instance, incidents of human rights violations may negatively affect the business's reputation and possibly lead to regulatory non-compliance, depending on what the business does with the information at hand. So this is by far an exhaustive list of categories, but it provides a good starting point for you to consider which risks are important to you. Yes. And as we like to say, with risks come great opportunities. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but we'd like to share two categories of opportunities with you to get you started. The first one is increased resilience, and this will essentially future-proof your business against any upcoming regulations, adverse impacts, and possible glitches in your supply chain. For example, let's call it the sub-opportunity number 3 related to increased resilience in early identification of inefficiencies and lagging suppliers. This can offer long-term protection against increased future costs or supply chain breakdowns as a result of unmanaged risks. And I also want to mention the opportunity of innovation. Because helping and nudging your suppliers to replace high impact materials used in their products will ultimately lead to more sustainable procurement of products for your business. And similarly, the early identification of emerging technologies can, for instance, be beneficial in terms of your scope 3 emissions. So if you have information on your suppliers and receive updates and feedback regularly, chances are you will know early on which technological improvements can be implemented to reduce emissions of your suppliers' operations. And you have a responsibility as a buyer to demand that such improvements are implemented. So opportunities are great and should be pursued. However, risks are what can cause the most harm, and businesses should take them seriously and work on reducing them. And this brings the question of where to start. The first step is to start mapping things. So you need an overview of who your suppliers and sub-suppliers are. And once you have that sorted, you can start assessing or assigning and mapping inherent risks associated with each supplier and supplier category. It is recommended to use different risk indices that can help determine risk based on either geographic location, industry, or product category. And once you have a clear idea of who your suppliers and sub-suppliers are and their inherent risks, it is time to engage with your suppliers to investigate further. Conduct due diligence on your prioritized suppliers and create an interaction model. And the interaction model defines expectations around how you interact at all times in the relationships. So, how much information you share, when and how you share it. So, in essence, the rules of engagement. And unlike a contract, which tends to be the work of lawyers and be written in language that is, or legal language, an interaction model is a more conceptual framework that includes roles and responsibilities, process maps, decision guidelines, and so forth. Uh, and this way, this may seem simple enough. However, there are some challenges you should be aware of and know how to deal with. And I am sure I could have listed many more challenges based on the experiences we have from working with clients, but I want to highlight three of them today to give us enough time to dive deep into each one of them. The first is low survey response rates when sending out due diligence questionnaires, for example. The risk can be mitigated through standardization of surveys. So, making it easy for your respondents to answer your questions will increase your response rate. So, make sure that you use a language that is clear and concise and a format that your respondents are comfortable with. And another way to mitigate risk is to allow for sharing of supplier responses. If the respondents can share their responses with multiple clients, they won't have to spend time answering the same questions for all their clients. And this is very much dependent on the first point of standardization, as the surveys need to follow a similar format with similar questions in order for the sharing of responses to make sense. And a third mitigating action is to send out reminders and establish supplier dialogue. And it is important to keep your suppliers informed about what you do and why you do it. If your suppliers understand why and feel that what they say matters, the chances are they will be more willing to fill out your surveys and contribute to with insightful information that you can use to decide how you are going to make improvements in your supply chain. And in addition, it can be a good idea to send out reminders every now and then to help your suppliers remember to complete the survey and provide feedback by the deadline. And another challenge that many of our clients are facing is prioritizing suppliers based on risk. And this can be solved by conducting preliminary risk assessments. This is where you determine risk based on recognized indices and geographic location, for example. So the indices give us information on the risk associated with doing business or having suppliers in a specific country. And second, you may use survey scores and what we like to call flag functionality, which help determine risk and criticality. So through surveys, you can increase the accuracy and reliability of your risk assessments, and your supplier's answers will help you understand which procedures are in place to ensure human and labor rights are respected and how the suppliers are working to reduce their environmental footprint. So we also recommend using a system that allows you to flag or mark certain answer choices that are associated with an extra high risk of or indication of actual severe human rights violations. And last, we have supplier spend, which can determine which suppliers are important to your organization and your influence over them. So it is arguably more important to focus on the suppliers from which you purchase large quantities, as they will be more likely to listen and make changes internally to meet your requirements. So these three things combined will make it easier for you to decide which suppliers you should prioritize and inspect further. And the last challenge I want to address today is meeting regulatory requirements, a topic that Konstantin discussed with you just a few moments ago. And here it is important to fully understand the requirements and also comparability across different regulations. So navigating the regulatory world can be very challenging. So to understand what your organization needs to do in order to meet regulatory requirements, you have to spend some time understanding the laws, directives, and frameworks that exist. And you should also understand how the different regulations compare to make sure you don't have to do the same work twice. And many elements in the CSRD, for example, overlap with the CSDDD, the Norwegian Transparency Act, the German Supply Chain Act. So just be aware of that as well. And I also want to mention the importance of using surveys and methods that align with multiple regulations. So get help finding or developing surveys and methods that align with the regulations that affect your organization. This will drastically reduce the amount of work that your organization must do to comply with the different regulations. And so before we take a closer look at CEMAsys' system solutions, I'd like to just share a few general tips with you to successfully manage your supply chain. And the first tip is simply to engage with your suppliers. So establish a dialogue and start the conversation early and focus on overcoming collaboration barriers like geographic distance, different views, or even sometimes culture. So build mutual trust by being transparent and fair and make sure you're both working towards a common goal. And a second tip is to find a system that is right for you. So create a list of system requirements that are important to your business and talk to providers that seem to meet those requirements. And a last tip is to measure performance. So set up KPIs that let you track progress and will help you change course early on if necessary. So let's talk a little bit about our system solutions. Our system currently comprises 5 different modules, soon to be 6. And today we will look at some of the functionality in our risk management and supply chain control module. We have created standardized surveys to streamline compliance that can be sent out to your suppliers at the click of a mouse. Here is an example of a survey that was made to help you comply with the German Transparency Act. So we're trying to make the processes a lot more simple for you. And you can also collect data from your suppliers and feed that information into the system to generate risk scores and analyze data. And you may also even collect data internally to ensure that your own operations are compliant and aligned with your targets and frameworks. And our system also allows for the suppliers and respondents to take action and use our system to analyze data and improve. And they can also change their own answers to show you that they are actively working on improving their score and ESG processes. And the last thing I'd like to share is some information on the visualization of data. We have an integrated risk map that will be available as soon as you've uploaded and categorized your suppliers. This will give you an overall understanding of risk based on where your suppliers are located. And in our dashboard, you can see aggregated data and results of your surveys. And this data is great for reporting as it is anonymous. And you can also view specific supplier scores to identify problem areas and be able to more closely track your supplier's progress and establish the necessary action plans. And that was the end of our presentation. So let's see if we have any questions from you. Konstantin, will you do us the honor and pick the first one?
Yes. So while you were talking, I looked in the chat and I got a first question. And I think it's more directed to you, Christian. And it says, while looking at actual negative impacts in your supply chain, this is rather straightforward. How do you identify risks?
Uh, that's a good question. It can sometimes be hard to know how to go about it to get the answers that you want, because you want honest answers from your suppliers, and some may be incentivized to hide the truth or not to give you the full story. So this is why we recommend asking about the systems and mechanisms that are in place to avoid or mitigate adverse impacts, rather than asking about the impacts directly. So, well, I can give you an example. If you want to know about the risk of child labor in your supplier's operations, you shouldn't necessarily ask straight out if there's a high risk of that happening. So instead, you could ask if they have mechanisms in place to verify the age of all their employees, for instance. Yeah, let me open the chat as well. Let's see. There's a question here. So, yeah, this would be for you, I think. Is it possible to create some synergies when working with different regulations? I guess they are asking if it's possible to lessen the work due to overlapping requirements, perhaps?
Yes, that's absolutely possible. So, just an example from those regulations that I went through. Let's
Yeah.
say that the CS will enter into force exactly the way it is right now, and no changes will be made to that. That would ensure you as a company that has to report under the EU taxonomy, for example, that if you follow exactly the process as outlined in the CS that you would already be able to tick this box of minimum safeguards, as you would be automatically compliant with them when following that. Also, when looking at the CSRD, you do already have a large chunk of the data that is required for your double materiality assessment. However,
Mm.
you should also look at your risks, and with those risks, I mean those financial risks that you could face as a company stemming from sustainability matters and financial opportunities stemming from the same ones. These you should also incorporate there. So there, one possible solution would be to widen the scope a little bit and do not only account for adverse impacts in your supply chain, but also integrate those financial risks and opportunities that you could see in those areas. So there's definitely room for synthesizing different kind of regulations, but you should also bear in mind that your company specific circumstances might make that you have to follow several different regulations. So keep that in mind when merging them together. And as you said earlier, make it also clear and concise so that you do not overload your suppliers with the information you require from them. But theoretically, that's absolutely possible.
Great. Any other questions? Let's see. Yeah, so we probably won't have time to go through all these questions today, and we will try to answer them via email later. Let's see, Konstantin, have you seen any questions that we should address right now?
Um, I don't know, maybe about the functionality of the system, whether you can have like a dialogue with your suppliers over there.
Yeah, so the system currently does not have that functionality, but that is something the tech team is looking into, because we do have a tech team here working on the system continuously, and making improvements. So that is not something we can say yes or no to right now, but we can talk to them and give you feedback on email, of course. Okay. I think for the other questions, we'll try to answer them via email later on. Yeah, I think I just want to thank everyone for coming and listening to us today. And like I said, the webinar will be uploaded to our webpage, so you can view it again if you want to. And so thank you very much for coming, and have a good weekend.
Goodbye.